So with that, we're going to, Christian kind of introduced it when he was doing the announcements, but next week we're going to start this series called The Bible on Trial, and in many ways this morning is going to be somewhat of, it's part one of that, even though next week is officially part one, but this is going to be kind of an introduction to what we're going to be looking at next week, and I don't have the click, oh, here it is, okay. It's going to be, I want to ask the question, why believe? And, some things are just too important to take lightly. You know what I mean? This veterinarian wasn't feeling too good, so he went to go see a doctor about his abdominal pains, and the doctor proceeded to ask him some questions, about how was he feeling, his diet and exercise, and health history, and how much rest he was getting, and so on. And the vet said, whoa, doc, I'm a doctor too. And when I'm examining my patients, I don't ask them all those questions. I just check them over and then make my diagnosis. So the doctor replied, and he says, okay, that's fair. And he walked over to the cabinet and took out a bottle of pills, and he came over and handed it to him. And he said, I want you to take 2 of these every 4 hours for the next 2 weeks, and that should take care of you. But if they don't, of course, we're going to have to put you down. Because, some things are just too important to take lightly. For example, when we look at the first part of the title, the first word in the title is the word why. Why am I here? Why are you here? Why is the universe here? Why did Jesus come? Why did he die? What did it accomplish? Well, okay, that's not a why question, but it's an important one anyway. What did it accomplish? And why is it important to me? So I want to address that first part first, and then we'll get to the second part in the second part. But I want to begin with this quote, and I don't know if it's original with me or something I just saw, dreamed sometime in time past or something, but all events in history have evidence, right? There's evidence that 9/11 happened. All events in history have evidence, but none have proof. If you stop and think about it, there is nothing that ever happened in the past that has absolute proof. Even eyewitness testimony is sometimes sus. You know what I mean? And so it's one of the reasons why I think in today's era of the internet, we've got so many conspiracy theories. You take the most outlandish issue possible, that wasn't supposed to happen, the most outlandish theories that you can think of, and most likely you're going to be able to find support for it on the internet. Because while all events have evidence, none of them have proof. So we can find proof for things that don't even exist. Loren Eiseley, this evolutionist and scientist from the 20th century, he said, man is a cosmic orphan. Okay, I got to get back on the same page here. There we go. There he is. And man is a cosmic orphan. Now, I didn't know Dr. Eiseley. I'm sure he was a very good guy. But that is absolutely one of the most disparaging comments I've ever heard in my life. We're a cosmic orphan. Does that make you feel minuscule or what? But if his statement is true, then we've come from nothing to become nothing, to go nowhere. Why? The Age of Enlightenment began about the middle of the 18th century. And Western philosophy has truly evolved in the ensuing almost 275 years since then. Through Romanticism and the Enlightenment, egalitarianism, pragmatism, modernism, postmodernism, Nietzsche existentialism, all of that stuff we've gone through philosophically. And it's been single focus to achieve one goal. And that goal is to say, how can I explain my existence without God? And, philosophies have come and gone, and the debate continues as to whether or not man is coming any closer to answering this question. but it's inarguably that man is the only species that is asking that. This is our pet dinosaur, Mojo the crested gecko, okay? We've had him for about 14 years. We have this cat named Peony. We've had her for a couple of years. And then we've got another cat named Mozart we've had for about three and some years. You can see they're doing what they do best. And then we've got Layla, who's the rock star of our neighborhood. And all of these animals are really cool. They're really good. But I have never seen one of them ask, how can I explain my existence without God? Because they ain't care. Man is the only one who tries to do that. Why? And I would suggest that it's because we all have this hole inside of us that longs for him, and yet we got this flesh within us that wants to deny him. David, the psalmist, wrote in Psalm chapter 8, beginning with verse 4, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? For you've made him a little lower than the angels, and you've crowned him with glory and honor. And you've made him to have dominion over the works of your hands, and have put all things under his feet." This morning, as we ponder the profundity of this 3,000-year-old psalm, I'd like for us to begin by considering these 12 prophecies about the crucifixion and their fulfillment. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. And the time that we have this morning is going to prevent me from going into the hermeneutics that would be involved in identifying all of them as messianic prophecies. Some could be relatively obscure, but let me just suffice it to say that all 12 of these Old Testament prophecies that were written at least 500 years before Christ and beyond were held to be messianic prophecies by the rabbinic teachings, at least up until the time of Christ. And so that that was inarguable among the Jewish communities until Jesus' passion. And it was only then when they had the choice of either accepting them as messianic prophecies and therefore accepting Jesus as the Messiah, or rejecting Jesus as the Messiah and then trying to explain those prophecies away. And so you've all been given this handout, and I'm going to go through them really quick because of the time constraints, and I know I'm going to go too fast for you to take too many copious notes, but for those of you that are interested in this, I wanted to show this. This is, and I kind of filled in the first one for you, and it's going to show all 12 of the prophecies. And the first one, you see where it says he was, what was prophesied about him, and then the second one is what the prophecy was, the reference of the prophecy, and then the third one is when that prophecy was written, and then the fourth one is what is their New Testament fulfillment, okay? So as we go to the first one, the first prophecy is that he would be betrayed by a friend. And this is prophesied in Psalm 41, verse 9, where David writes, "Even my own familiar friend whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." And this was written David wrote about 1000 BC, and we find its fulfillment in the 14th chapter of Mark, verse 10, where Mark writes, "And then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them." And of course, the other gospel writers would bear this out as also. And then the second prophecy is that he would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. We see this prophesied by Zechariah in Zechariah 11:12. "And then I said to them, if it's agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. And so they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver." And Zechariah wrote around between 520 and 518 BC, one of the last of the New Testament writers, or Old Testament writers. And we find its fulfillment in Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 to 15, where he says, "Then one of the 12, called Judas, went to the chief priests and said, 'What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?' And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver." Of course, we're all familiar with that story. The third prophecy is that he would be that the money would be used to buy a potter's field. And even that was prophesied. If we look at the next verse in Zechariah 11:13, "And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that princely price they paid set on me. And so I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. That's Zechariah, 500 years before Christ. It sounds like it's the New Testament, like one of the gospel writers, doesn't it? But the gospel fulfills this in Matthew 27, verses 6 and 7. But the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, "It's not lawful to put them in the treasury, because they are the price of blood." And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. You know, if somebody was going through Jerusalem and they died and they didn't have any money on them, they would bury them in the potter's field. That's what that was for. The fourth prophecy is that he would be spat upon and beaten. And we find this prophesied in Isaiah chapter 50 in the 6th verse, where Isaiah writes, "I gave my back to those who struck me." Notice the capital letters in the personal pronouns here. "And my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting." Isaiah wrote no later than 701, 681 BC. At least that recent, if not longer ago. And we find the fulfillment in the 26th chapter of Matthew, verse 67, where Matthew says, "And they spat on his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palm of their hands." Number 5, that he would be silent before his accusers. It's prophesied also in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 7, if you're familiar with Isaiah 53. And it says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. And he was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." You know, we've got complete manuscripts of Isaiah that predate Jesus by almost 200 years. And yet you read Isaiah 53, and there's the only more complete description of the crucifixion that you'll find in Scriptures was actually written before Isaiah. And so it was prophesied between 701 and 681 BC, and we'll find its fulfillment in Matthew chapter 27, starting with verse 13. "And then Pilate said to him, 'Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?' But he answered them not a word. So the governor marveled greatly, because he opened not his mouth." Number 6, that he would be pierced. And again, Zechariah is the one who prophesies this in Zechariah chapter 12 in the 10th verse, where he says, "I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. And then they will look on me," capital letter, "whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one who mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one who grieves for a firstborn." And then, you know, that again, written between 520 and 518. And we find its fulfillment in the Gospel of John. We'll look there this time, chapter 19, verse 34. "But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out." And you can also see in chapter 20, verses 25 to 27, that being repeated. 7th prophecy is that he would die with transgressors. Isaiah is our prophet once again, and Isaiah 53, verse 12, "And he was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." The date again between 701 and 681, and we find its fulfillment in Matthew 27, verse 38. "Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and another on the left." Crucified between 2 thieves, or transgressors, we could say. Number 8, that he would be ridiculed by onlookers. You know, most of these elements we're familiar of because of the gospel stories, but you may not be familiar with the Old Testament prophecies that predicted them. And David, again, Psalm 22, which is probably a more description of the crucifixion than even Isaiah 53 is. But Psalm 22, verses 7 and 8, David writes, "All those who see me ridicule me, and they shoot out the lip and shake the head, saying, 'He trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him.'" And again, about 1000 BC was when it was prophesied. And we find one of the places where it's fulfilled is Luke 23, verse 35. And the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them sneered, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen of God." Prophecy number 9, that he would cry out in thirst. If you've ever seen a Jesus movie, you've seen where he said that, but this was actually another thing that was prophesied by the prophet David in Psalm 22, verse 15. "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death." And David wrote around a millennia before Christ. And we see a fulfillment in the 19th chapter of John, verse 28, where, there he is. "After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were accomplished, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, said, 'I thirst.'" Now, if you think he just said that so he could fulfill Psalm 22, you haven't looked at what the crucifixion was all about very much. You haven't looked into how devastating that kind of experience would have been. 10th prophecy is that he would feel forsaken by God. I always hesitate to say that he was forsaken by God. I don't know that God ever forsook him. We could say that he forsook him on our behalf. You know, I get that statement, but at least Jesus felt like he was forsaken. That was his human experience. I have no doubt of that one. Because it was prophesied in Psalm 22 also in the opening verses. And tell me if you didn't think this was a New Testament reading. my God, why have you forsaken me? And why are you so far from helping me? And from the words of my groaning, my God, I cry out in the daytime, and you do not hear. In the night season, I'm not silent." Again, 1,000 years BC, in the fulfillment we find in Mark 15:34. "At the ninth hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, saying, Eloi, 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 lama sabachthani." Translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Number 11, that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb. Prophesied in Isaiah 53, we'll go back to the prophet Isaiah again, 53 verse 9, "And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth." You know, archaeology proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Isaiah lived almost 7 centuries before Christ. So it was prophesied between 701 to 681. And we see its fulfillment in the 23rd chapter of Luke, where he says, "Now behold, there was a man named Joseph, a council member, a good and just man, who had not consented to their decision indeed. And he was from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who himself was also waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock, where no one had been laying before." And then number 12, I know whoever did your insert has a typo and says 6, but those of you that have been homeschooled, just cross out the word 6 and write the word 12. You'll know how to do that. You can help the public school guys if they have trouble with that. Number 12 is that he would resurrect. Prophesied again in Psalms, but a different psalm, but also written by David, Psalm 16, verse 10. "For you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." And David wrote about 1000 BC, and we'll look to Mark chapter 16, verses 9 and 10. "Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. And she went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept." So he was also resurrected. So not only do we have the Old Testament prophecy, and that's not an exhaustive list. There are at least 24 that I think we could say were undeniable prophecies about his passion, death, burial, and resurrection. But there also we have, I want to just look at real quickly, some 7 pieces of other physical evidences for the resurrection. And some of these you could say, well, that's a little sketchy, but when we put them all together, you know, I don't, if you say none of them stand on their own, but when you put them all together, it makes a pretty convincing case. And again, this is not an exhaustive list either. But the first piece I would offer would be the church. You know, we're here. In fact, understanding the difference in time zones, every country on earth has people gathering together on this day, this morning, to celebrate what happened 2,000 years ago. And just the existence of the church, I think, is one of the pieces of evidence that I would submit for it. You know, it says that over 5,000 people became members of the church less than 2 months after the resurrection because they did not doubt the truth of it. There's not a single example of anyone who testified to the resurrection of Jesus, of that first generation, there's not a single example of any of them ever recounting that encounter, or recounting it, just saying that it didn't happen. Not a single example of that. There's no Jewish or Roman rebuttal of the resurrection. Yeah, they tried to say, oh, the apostles stole him or whatever, but there's never been any evidence of that. Number two, Sunday worship. Now, I know there are those that would take issue with this, but I think that I could make a pretty solid case that, I mean, it was the Jews who for over a millennium and a half had held Saturday as a sacred worship day. All of a sudden, these Jews, these covenant Jews, began gathering on the first day of the week to have church. And we can see a couple of examples of people gathering on the first day of the week in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, and 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. Contrary to certain internet sites and fictional novels, this is really what happened. Number three, the New Testament testimony. And what I mean by that is this, when we look at what the New Testament says, you can say, well, yeah, but that's circular reasoning. No, it's not. There are 27 books of the New Testament. They all testify to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if they are untrue, then the burden of proof is on the person that says that they're untrue. Because all physical evidence supports the veracity. And there's no evidence that detracts from it. The New Testament alone can stand on its own feet, and it all testifies to the resurrection. F.F. Bruce, great scholar from the 20th century, said this. He said, if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would be generally regarded as beyond all doubt. You know, in a court of law today, if you can provide the evidence that is beyond a reasonable doubt, that's enough for a conviction. And the evidence that we can look at in the Bible for the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ is beyond reasonable doubt. Number four, I would suggest the stone that was rolled over the tomb. Frank Morrison, who wrote the book, Who Moved the Stone, said that it would have weighed approximately 2 tons, 4,000 pounds. I've read other accounts that doesn't have it quite that big, but it's not something that a couple of big strong men could reach down, pick up, and carry away. It would have taken an army of men, and it would have made a lot of noise to do. And so, who rolled the stone? There had been a garrison of guards that were put there, Roman garrison of guards that were put there to guard the tomb, because the Pharisees said, the disciples said he's going to raise again, they might come and steal his body. So Pilate said, you can have a garrison of your own guys, or my own guys to watch it. In fact, they put a Roman seal over the tomb. The seal of Rome. To mess with the seal of Rome was to mess with Caesar. To break a Roman seal was the equivalent of treason, and it was the penalty was death before a trial. You would not mess with a Roman seal, and yet the stone was moved, and no one was ever tried or convicted or punished for it. In fact, it says, my fifth piece of evidence would be the 500 people that, according to 1 Corinthians 15, saw him at one time, right before his ascension. 500 people testified to the risen Jesus. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, and most of them are still alive today, so if you don't believe me, go ask them. And not a single one of them ever recanted. And then lastly, I would say the empty tomb. The empty tomb. You know, one of the explanations of that is that the disciples went to the wrong tomb. I went to the wrong one. Oh, boy, do I have egg on my face. You know, no, if they tried to say that, all they had to do is take them to the right one. End of story. The other ones, the other way that I tried to explain away is what's called the swoon theory. You get that, the swoon theory, that Jesus just had a bad case of the vapors. You know, he just swooned, and then later he came back to life. This liberal preacher on the East was addressing this one time, and he taught the swoon theory. And the next day, a man from that congregation wrote to the local newspaper and asked the religion editor what he thought about the subject. And so the religion editor's response to that was, "We'll beat your preacher with a Roman flagrum until there's hardly any skin left on his body, until he's not even recognizable as a man. Nail him to a cross and hang him out in the Middle Eastern sun for 6 hours. Run a spear through his heart, wrap him up like a mummy, put him in a sealed, airless tomb for 36 hours, and see what happens." All right? And then I said that was last, but I got another one. Last was the apostles. When we look at the apostles, well, let's just look at what happened to the apostles, okay? We know what happened with Judas. You know, he couldn't handle it, so he hung himself. But of the surviving 11, of the 11 apostles that were alive after Jesus' resurrection and ascension into heaven, let's just look at them. How did the apostles die? Well, first of all, we got Andrew. He was crucified on a traverse cross. You've seen the St. Andrew's cross, the cross that goes like an X. Bartholomew was flayed with knives. That means he was skinned alive. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded. James, the son of Alphaeus, sometimes known James the Lesser or Little James, was bludgeoned and then sawn in two. Matthew was axed to death. Peter was hung upside down because he said he wasn't worthy to be crucified in the same way as Lord had been. Philip was hung from a pillar until he died. John, the apostle, was boiled in oil, and when that didn't kill him, then he was exiled to Patmos, where he lived until a ripe old age, where he was finally allowed to go die a natural death. Thaddeus was bludgeoned to death. Thomas was speared to death. And Simon was sawn in two. So in the words of Dr. A.E. Wilder-Smith, who was a brilliant, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, he was a tremendously highly educated, smart dude who was an agnostic/atheist when he first went into postgraduate work. But while he was at Cambridge, I think it was, he met C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis showed him the evidence for the resurrection, and he became a very strong evangelical believer. And Dr. Wilder-Smith said, "He who thinks has to believe." Just as simple as that. Okay. Here is a picture of a ruler. Well, it's a piece of a ruler. It's a ruler after it's been through children's church. Now, if I were to ask you what's the distance between these two hash marks, what would you say? How many? What? Everybody says 1 inch. That would be the consensus, right? Anybody disagree? We have a doctor that disagrees. Yes. And the best we could say is that's approximately 1 inch. Because the only true inch that exists is found in this place. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is found just outside of D.C. And there they have the one true inch, and everything else at best is just a replica of that. They've tried to mimic that. They've tried to measure exactly what that 1 inch is. But at best, this ruler is only 99.9999% of an inch. It's not 100% of an inch. And the reason why I point this out is God has made the standard of getting into heaven as perfect. That's the standard. You don't go to heaven if you ain't perfect. Okay? Now, most people think that they get to heaven by having more good stuff than they have bad stuff. You know, and you ask the man on the street, are you going to go to heaven when they die? And they say, the answer is, well, I'd like to think that I am because I'm a good person. Which means all you have to do is think up 51% more good stuff than you have 49% bad stuff, right? And then you're in. If that were true, that would make heaven 49% bad. And that's far from perfect. Even if you were 0.99% good, that's not good enough for heaven because the standard of getting into heaven is perfect. I mean, the closest any of us get to perfect is when we turn in a job resume, right? Jesus became the perfect man so that he could become the perfect payment for our sin. And it's only through him that we have acceptance into God's perfect heaven. Don't think of Christ's victory as a way up, like, you know, Jesus died so he can get me up into heaven. Don't think of it in those kind of terms. Think of it more as in a way out. You know, Christ's victory was so that he could break me out of the chains of darkness of this world. We sang repeatedly about that earlier in worship. Christ died and rose to give us victory. Then why do we see so many defeated Christians, if that's the case? Well, I admit the problem with that, but we need to understand that, you know, and I hear people ought to say, well, I'd believe in Jesus if it wasn't for the Christians, you know, but the Christians are not the standard. Jesus is. And so what does the defeated Christian have to do with the risen Lord? In fact, I don't know any follower of any religious figure that hasn't failed in their following of, in their discipleship of that religious figure. I want to, some of you may be familiar with Max Lucado's book, He Chose the Nails. And I'm going to read, for those of you that haven't read it, I'm going to read a portion of it as we kind of wrap things up a little bit. This would be my first wrapping things up a little bit. And it's a section from the book that he calls The Spit of the Soldiers. The whipping was the first deed of the soldiers. The crucifixion was the third. No, I didn't skip the second. We'll get back to that in a minute. Though his back was ribboned with wounds, the soldiers loaded the crossbeam on Jesus' shoulders and marched him to the place of the skull and executed him. Now, we don't fault the soldiers for these two actions. After all, they were just following orders. But what's hard for us to understand is what they did in between. Here's Matthew's description. He's going to be reading, Lucado likes the New Century Version. Jesus was bitten with whips and handed over to the soldiers to be crucified. The governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's palace, and they all gathered around him. They took off his clothes, put on a red robe on him. Using thorny branches, they made him a crown and put it on his head and a stick in his right hand. Then the soldiers bowed before Jesus and made fun of him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on Jesus. Then they took his stick and began to beat him on the head. When they finished, the soldiers took off the robe, put on his own clothes on him again, and they led him away to be crucified. It's Matthew 27, verses 26 to 31. The soldier's assignment, just continuing to read from the book, the soldier's assignment was simple. Take the Nazarene to the hill and kill him. But they had another idea. They wanted to have some fun first. Strong, rested, armed soldiers encircled an exhausted, nearly dead Galilean carpenter and beat up on him. The scourging was commanded. The crucifixion was ordered. But who would have drawn pleasure out of spitting on a half-dead man? Spitting isn't intended to hurt the body. It can't. Spitting is intended to degrade the soul, and it does. What were the soldiers doing? Were they not elevating themselves at the expense of another? They felt big by making Christ look small. Allow the spit of the soldiers, he continues, to symbolize the filth in our hearts, and then observe what Jesus does with our filth. He carries it to the cross. Through the prophet, he said, I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Isaiah 50, verse 6. We looked at that earlier. Mingled with his blood and sweat was the essence of our sin. God could have deemed otherwise. In God's plan, Jesus was offered wine for his throat, so why not a towel for his face? Simon carried the cross of Jesus, but didn't mop the cheek of Jesus. Angels were a prayer away. Couldn't they have taken the spittle away? They could have. But Jesus never commanded them to. For some reason, the one who chose the nails also chose the saliva. Along with the spear and the sponge of men, he bore the spit of men. The sinless one took on the face of a sinner so that sinners could take a look on the face of a saint. Or take on the face of a saint. Which this brings us to the second part of our title. That's why. Now I want to look at the second part of it. Why believe? In other words, someone might say, why is the issue of believing so important? After all, I believe he rose from the dead. Now, I know there are some who say, these are questions that are statements that I've heard stated by others before. I want to go to hell so I can party with my crew. You ever heard that before? Yeah. We had a neighbor a long time ago who said, just bury me face down so I can see where I'm going. I mean, these are the maxims of ill-informed Neanderthals who probably need to get out a little bit more and exercise the brains that God has given them, than asking the question, what is more significant? This vapor of temporary existence or eternity? And so with that, I want to show this short video clip.
My name is Thomas, and I struggle with doubt. I followed Jesus for years. From the very first day he called me, I saw things so amazing they defied explanation. I believed. But then things fell apart. I witnessed the betrayal that led to the cruel march to Calvary and his agonizing crucifixion. I survived, but everyone I knew scattered. My world collapsed. Then came news of the empty tomb, the very first Easter. But I resisted. The image of his broken, lifeless body was still burned into my memory. I experienced his death. Then I couldn't believe. Not until I see the scars with my own eyes and touch them with my own hands, I told the others. I wasn't ready to put my trust in something again. But Jesus came to me. He knew my doubts. He even named them. But he wasn't angry. He didn't rebuke me or dismiss me. He looked at me with those familiar eyes and offered me his scarred hands and side. In that moment, I experienced his resurrection, and I believed. I know firsthand it's difficult to believe in what you can't see. And yet all around you are people whose lives and stories have scars that bear witness to the meaning of Easter. Yes, these people have been wounded, but they've experienced redemption and healing through Jesus. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were meant to rescue the doubters, the debtors, and the broken, people like you and me. He met my doubts with grace and love, and he only asked one thing of me: believe.
Sometimes I think Thomas gets kind of a bad rap. You know, they think Thomas is his last name, first name is Doubting. And, you know, I get that, but let me explain what I mean by that I sometimes think he gets an unfair shake. When it comes to unbelievers, I think they generally can fall into one of two categories. There are those who simply don't believe. You know, they honestly don't believe it's true. That was Thomas. He honestly didn't believe Jesus was alive. In other words, they are honest believers, okay? But then there are those who don't believe because they don't want to. They don't care whether it's true or not. That's not part of the equation, you know. And in the final analysis, it's just very irrelevant. No matter facts or truth is going to change their mind. They're just not going to believe. Oh, they can sometimes throw up smoke screens and you know, they'll say something about, you know, well, I believe in God, but he's not fair. Or, you know, I prayed this prayer one time and God didn't answer it. You know, my grandmother was sick, 96-year-old grandmother was sick with cancer, and I prayed and he didn't heal her. Or you know, a good God would never allow this or that. You know, I don't think honest unbelievers do that. But the dishonest ones do. Thomas was one of the honest ones. He was one of the former. I was one of the latter. I knew the truth. But I didn't want it because I had my own God, I had my own world, I had my own gig that I wanted to do. And so I think, you know, we I guess you could say that this morning, assembled here, we could probably divide us into three categories. There are those who believe, and those who don't believe because they don't believe, and those who don't believe because they choose not to believe. And so I'm going to ask, and this is, I'm going to ask the worship team to go ahead and come on back up. And I'm sorry I didn't say anything before, but are you guys even in here? Yeah, there's one. Okay. Yeah, go ahead and come. There you go. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with this. Just another. This is even shorter than the other clip, but it's one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century was a guy by the name of S.M. Lockridge. His name was S.M. Lockridge, or Shadrach Meshach Lockridge. He was a preacher's kid who was born to be a preacher, and he was. Like I said, I mean, greatest preacher I heard of the 20th century. And there's several video clips of his that are going around, and maybe you've seen this one or one of the other ones. But this is for all of the believers here this morning. Okay, this is for you.
The Bible says, my king is the king of the Jews. He's the king of Israel. He's the king of righteousness. He's the king of the ages. He's the king of heaven. He's the king of glory. He's the king of kings. And he's the Lord of lords. That's my king. I wonder, do you know him? My king is a sovereign king. No means of measure can define his limitless love. He's enduringly strong. He's entirely sincere. He's eternally steadfast. He's immortally graceful. He's imperially powerful. He's impartially merciful. Do you know him? He's the greatest phenomenon that has ever crossed the horizon of this world. He's God's Son. He's a sinner's Savior. He's the centerpiece of civilization. He's unparalleled. He's unprecedented. He is the loftiest idea in literature. He's the highest personality in philosophy. He's the fundamental doctrine of true theology. He's the only one qualified to be an all-sufficient Savior. I wonder if you know him today. He supplies strength for the weak. He's available available for the tempted and the tried. He sympathizes and he saves. He strengthens and sustains. He guards and he guides. He heals the sick. He cleanses the lepers. He forgives sinners. He discharges debtors. He delivers the captive. He defends the feeble. He blesses the young. He serves the unfortunate. He regards the aged. He rewards the diligent. And he purifies the meek. I wonder if you know him. He's the key to knowledge. He's the wellspring of wisdom. He's the doorway of deliverance. He's the pathway of peace. He's the roadway of righteousness. He's the highway of holiness. He's the gateway of glory. Do you know him? Well, his life is matchless. His goodness is limitless. His mercy is everlasting. His love never changes. His word is enough. His grace is sufficient. His reign is righteous. And his yoke is easy. And his burden is light. I wish I could describe him to you. He's indescribable. He's incomprehensible. He's invincible. He's irresistible. Well, you can't get him out of your mind. You can't get him off of your hand. You can't outlive him, and you can't live without him. Well, the Pharisees couldn't stand him, but they found out they couldn't stop him. Pilate couldn't find any fault in him. Terror couldn't kill him. Death couldn't handle him, and the grave couldn't hold him. Yeah! That's my king. That's my king.
So that was for the believers. And if you're here this morning and you would fall in one of those two categories of non-believers, you know, I think even if you could look at your life and see it as being somewhat defeated, as Dr. Lockridge says, he's the God of the many chances, not second chance, but he has a limitless amount of grace to bestow upon those who will come to him. And I'm going to do something. We don't normally do this sort of thing on Sundays. It's kind of varied, but I'm going to lead us all in prayer. And I'm going to ask, first I want to ask for those that you've been identifying as, you know, just living a Christian life in somewhat a defeated way. I'm going to give you a chance to just respond to that. And then, you know, if you're here today and you would fall into the category that I was in for so many years, you know, just the believer that didn't want to, you know, I knew the Bible was the Word of God. I knew Jesus rose from the dead, but I just didn't want to give up my own gods, the God of me. And so I threw up my smoke screens. And if you're tired of that, you know, I would just ask you, how's that working out for you? But if you're tired of that, I want to give you a chance to respond to it as well. And we're going to do it real quick. Not going to be this repeated like anybody else. You know, I know the time is getting late. But then lastly, I want to give a chance to those, if you're here this morning and you haven't believed because you just didn't know that it was true. And we've just scratched the surface this morning on the evidence that it is. It's as Dr. Wilder Smith said, he who thinks has to believe. And I want to give a chance for you to respond as well. And so I'm going to ask us all to close our eyes, and then I'm going to lead us in prayer, and then when I'll give you each a chance to respond in turn, and just by raising your hand. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for what it represents. Your Son is risen. Lord, he is risen indeed. And he is our King. And the day will come, whether it's now or in the future, that every knee will bow and acknowledge him as the Lord of Lords. And I know we have people here this morning that have probably done so. And yet their life hasn't been full of your Spirit. Their life has been lived in kind of a selfish, carnal sort of way. And we know that that's not fulfilling. We know that all it does is bring guilt and defeat, and that you have a way that is far superior than that. And so what a blessed opportunity that you give us this morning, that if for any that's here today and can identify with that it's not a question of salvation, but just a question of living in victory, because you've promised that to all who bow their knee to you. And so I just want to give a chance, Lord, and that you would speak, that your Spirit would move in our midst today. And for those that would be that, and if you're here today and you want that to be different, I would just ask if you'd raise your hand. Any others? Okay, you can go ahead and please keep your hands up for just a second. I'll be fast with this. But if there's any others here this morning that you were the kind of believer that, or non-believer that I was, that just that nothing here this morning has really changed your mind, but maybe possibly it's changed your heart. And you've been one of those dishonest believers where you said, well, I just don't believe, and you use the smoke screens and whatnot. But you've come to the place where you're tired of that. Would you like to raise your hand? And Lord, if there's anybody here this morning that just didn't know that it was true, they've lived with what the press has to say. They've heard what their friends had to say, or they've watched some of the silly stuff you can find on the internet, and that you have, through the power of your Spirit, have brought them to a place of realizing that it's true, that Jesus did die and he did rise from the dead, and he did so because of what John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever would believe in him will not perish but have everlasting life. And God, if there's anybody here this morning that has not been on this side of that equation and would like to make that choice now, would you please raise your hand this morning? So, Father, I pray for those that have responded. I lift them up to you now. Pray that you be with them. And for those that have responded accordingly and have made that choice to follow you in the fullness of your Spirit, in the victory that you've offered them, God, give them strength and encouragement. Fill them to overflowing with your Spirit. You have defeated this, not only the penalty of sin, but the power of sin. And I pray that they could walk in that victory. Encourage them and come alongside them. And for those who have had some sort of maybe a twinge inside of them that they should respond to one of those questions, one of those opportunities, if they and yet they haven't, don't give them a moment of peace. I pray, God, you just bear down on them. Don't let up until they say, Uncle, because I know how much you love them. And I know what you want for them, and it's not what they have now. So do whatever is needed. God, we thank you for what this day represents. And thank you for all the people that have come out this morning. Thank you for the great time that we've had in worship and in your word. And God, we just give you all the praise and glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's please stand.